Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'll try to walk you through the step-by-step process on how to achieve the same interactive 3D effect in your own React app, and most especially being able to control your spline objects animation from your React project frontend. So let's see how it's made. First, what we have to do is to create a 3D object in Spline. If you don't know about Spline, I'm going to leave a link in the description to other YouTube videos that will help you get started with Spline, because this won't be a Spline tutorial. First thing we have to do is to go to Spline, and here you see I already created a box which is going to represent my 3D image over here, just for the purpose of this tutorial so that it's not too lengthy. Now I have a cube, and my end goal here is to be able to trigger an effect on this cube. Let's say it's growth effect. Once the user, anyone clicks on a particular button on my front end. So the first thing I'm going to do in order to create that effect in Spline is to give this box a state, right? If I want to create a new state, what I just have to do is to adjust either the size or the height or the position of the object. Then I'll save it as a new state. So this is what I've done here. If you check on your right panel here, you see state, right? I've created the base state, which is this state everyone can see. Then if I select the state, if I just name this state, because for the sake of the tutorial, I don't have any other thing to name it as. So if I name it as state, you can see that I've tried to change the height of this box object. If I go back to base state, you see it goes back to this original state. So what we need to do next is to create a trigger in our spline that actually helps us to understand exactly what we need to do, and where we can also test it out and see if it actually works, right? So what next thing I'm going to do is to create an object. So what we are just trying to do now is try to test out if this can actually work, right? Okay, let me preview it and see how it looks. Okay, good. Now what I need to do next is create an event on this ellipse, right, that helps us trigger the two states of this blue box here. So first thing I'm going to do is to change the title of this to trigger. Once we are able to create a trigger, the next thing I want to do is try to create an event so that this ellipse is able to trigger the states we have for our box, right? So I don't need to change the state of this trigger. I just need to change the event of what happens, or what happens when the user clicks on this circle, on this ellipse, right? So once I click on this plus button in front of events, it brings out a panel. First thing you see is your the start option, which is not what we need. That this means that on start of the page this happens, but we want it to be that on click or when an action is triggered this happens. So we check if we have that options on Spline, which we do, and you can see that a lot of other options that we can make use of. But in this tutorial, we are only going to be focusing on what happens when an event or when an action is triggered using the mouse. And on the mouse options, we have 4 different options. Whereas in these options, we are only interested in making use of 2 of those options, which is when the mouse is pressed or when the mouse is down. And now I'm going to show you why we cannot use one of these 2 options. On mouse press, if we choose mouse press, right, it gives us, okay, I'll change the options from start to mouse press, which is what we want. And what happens when this mouse press on this object, right? We want to make sure that a particular action happens. So we have to also create a condition to add actions to trigger in this event, right? So we want a transition effect, which is from a smaller state to a larger state, right? So it's a transition effect. So we are going to click that. Then We can further edit our transition effect by clicking this drop down to show other things that we can also control. But in this case, you will realize that it only gives us transition using this target, right? But we need one more thing, right? We need to see if we can create a toggle effect, because it's not going to be really good. It don't look nice if we can only click the button once, and once we click the button again, it doesn't actually return the object to its original state. Like in this state of this animation which we have here, for example, if I click on the work button, it takes the object out of the screen. And if I click on the close button, it brings it back to its original state, which is exactly what we want to recreate here, which this option doesn't give us, and that's why we can't use it. So I'm going to change it to mouse down, and on this object that remains the same, this transition remains the same. Now we have a toggle option, right? If you click on the drop down, you see once, repeat each time, and toggle, which is exactly what we need. We want to set it to toggle, and every other thing from current state to base state. Now base state is current. We want to toggle, something is wrong. Mouse down on this object, transition, target. The target is not the trigger, the target is the cube, right? And we want to create a toggle effect. So we want to change it from any current position it's in to its new state. The current position we have now is the base state, which is the original state we have. So it won't work well if we leave it on base state, or it won't even work at all if we leave it on base state, because the current state and the base state are actually the same in this regard. Now, the next thing is to try to test if it really works. So we close this, and we preview to see if it works. So once you click on the button, you see it works. It triggers the change of state. Then if you click it again, it toggles back to its original state, which is exactly the effect we are looking for. Now it doesn't end there. Next is to do what we really are here for in this tutorial. Try to see how we can create the same effect without using this trigger from Spline, and using our own specified trigger on our front end React code. But what I do first is, because I'm not going to need this, I'm going to keep it in Spline, but I'm going to make sure that it's not visible to anyone, or either is it clickable by anyone. So there are two ways I can do this. First is, if I go on the left panel here where I have the trigger, if I over on it, several options comes out, which is to lock it, to put it out of view, and also to create events for it. But what I need now is to try and hide it from view from anyone to see or have any interactions with it. The other thing I can do, which is the second option, is to try and move it out of the scene. The reason I prefer doing this is because if I need to come back to quickly make changes to the object, or I can easily drag it out before, like, instead of looking for it everywhere on the scene. But it's preferential. It depends on what you want. You can also hide it away from the scene. It's up to you to use whatever you like. Okay, so once I'm done with that and I'm satisfied, I'm going to check it again to make sure it's really out of the scene, because I don't need to use it for now. I just need it to be there on the scene. Right. So the next thing we do after that is to try and export it. And if you are new to Spline, the first thing you see is this public URL. You see the cursor on the public URL, which is not what we need. But what we need for this tutorial is go 2 steps down to code export, and on your drop down on the right, you see React. We have different options: Next.js, React 5. But in this tutorial, like you already know, we are going to be using React. So once that is done, it loads up our React code, which we can easily just copy here and paste in our React frontend. For learning purposes, I want to note that anytime you make changes to your Spline 3D object here, you have to come back to your export. You don't need to recopy the whole Spline code, but you have to come back to your export and update the code export. And once you do that, it's going to automatically alert you that, okay, this code export has been updated, and you can now go to wherever front end you are making use of it, and you will see the changes you've made automatically. So you don't need to copy this entire code again. Just make changes on your Spline, then export the code to wherever you're making use of it, and it updates automatically. So I think we are done with Spline now. It's time to move over to our React frontend. And for this, I'll be making use of Code Sandbox. Okay, now that we're on Spline, Code Sandbox, first thing we need to do is to create a component. I'm going to create a component. I'm going to call it Spline box. This is where I'm going to paste all the code I get from Spline directly without having to add anything to it. Okay, so let's drag this here. Move. Okay, so I'll go to Spline, copy this code here, and come back to Sandbox and paste. That's it. Okay, so here you will notice that we already have an import from Spline, and what we need to do is to make sure that this import is available as a dependency on our Spline project. And you can see I've already installed two of the imports we are going to need from two libraries, which is Spline2/React Spline and also Spline2/runtime. Now, if you don't have, because if you're using it for the first time, you don't have these dependencies, the fastest and easier way to do this is to copy this library endpoint, then paste it here in your search bar. Once you paste it, it's going to bring the exact library for you. Then click on it and it installs. If you are using VS Code, you can use npm install or any other library you are yarn install or any other library you're making use of. Okay, so I'm going to change this to app because we already have another app.js down there. So I'll use the Spline box here. And okay, let me write all the code I need so that I'll come back and explain. Okay, so to run over it again, first what we did is to create a React component and call this Spline box, right? And next import React use textbook, see here, and this Spline component from the Spline2/React Spline library, which is what we need now. So the next thing we did is setting up an handler called handleLoad that helps us determine when the Spline component from the Spline or the Spline scene is fully loaded, especially when we have initial animations coming from Spline and we don't want anything by any interaction by the user to affect it until it's fully loaded, right? So this is where this is useful. So we check for when it loads, it runs and sets loaded. This is true instead of false. Next, on our app.js, we will integrate this Spline box into our app components and write up controls that trigger animations from our UI. So the first thing to do is to import my Spline box here. Remember, we used on Spline, we used mouse down as our option for the events, and that's why we are calling mouse down now. And we then try to look for the mouse down event on our trigger. Here we use useRef to store Spline instance. Yep. Then we define the function trigger animation, which trigger those named events in your Spline scene from your front end. Okay. So let's see if this still. Cool. Yeah. Still fine. Works perfectly. Okay. Okay. So then the next thing to do is now to, trigger our animation. See if it really works when we click on that trigger object. But first, we need to create a button or something like a text, clickable text to, trigger this animation from our front end. And I'm going to create another component and name it switch. First, I want to go to UIverse, yep, and make use of this easy fancy button as a trigger. So now in this switch, we want once the switch is clicked on the switch component, we don't want it to happen here. We want it to happen over on the switch component to make our code much more cleaner. So I'm going to send trigger animation as a property. Okay, so let's see if it works. We'll go back to our page. Okay, now this still works. Yeah. Now we need to make sure our button shows up on the page, and the reason we're not seeing it now is actually it's hidden somewhere on the page. So what we need to do is to go back to our app.js, then give this a style. On the switch component, we need to change our position of the switch to absolute. Let's see. Cool. Now it works. Oh, okay. What could be the problem? Great. Now we see that once the button is checked, it actually does the forward animation, but it doesn't reverse the animation or toggle the object back to its original state. So what could it be the problem? Let's go back to our code and go to switch component. Now we see what's happening here now. So what we did here is if change is false, it should trigger the animation when the input is actually checked, right? But what happens when the input is unchecked? Nothing. So what we want to do here is to make sure that we have a reverse animation that takes back this object, this Spline object, back to its original position and creates a toggle effect at the end. Now, in order to do that, you see we are passing this as a property, but we also need to go to our app.js and double this animation, and let's copy this, duplicate it, then change this to reverse animation. Okay, then instead of emitEvent, I'll say emitEventReverse. Cool, then that is all. So what I have to do now is to pass the same as a property as well. Then I'll go to my save it first, go to my switch component, add this as a prop, then come and call it a function here. Okay, then I'll initiate it here. Right, so this should work now. If change is false, it triggers the animation. However, if change is true, it reverses the animation to its original state, and vice versa, to work as a toggle. So let's see. I will load my page now. Now let's see if it works. Okay, go. Oh, now it works perfectly, right? So this is how easy it is to create your own trigger animation using Spline and also your React content. And that's a wrap. I really hope this has helped you understand how to control your spline scenes directly from React. Actually, it took me a while to figure this out since there weren't many tutorials out there. And if you found this useful, please don't forget to give me a like, drop a comment if you have any questions or a request on what you want us to do next, and subscribe for more cool front-end and 3D integration tips. I've got more video tutorials like this coming, so stay tuned and happy coding.